John. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. How are we doing? Can we see that? I'm
Yep.
see, Lance is shaking his head yes, so I'll call it good. All right. Uh, Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Tom Isenhart. I'm a professor in natural resource ecology and management at Iowa State University, where I have a teaching and research appointment and teach in the areas of natural sciences and the research you're going to be hearing some about here. So Sean asked me to talk a little bit about edge of field practices and incorporating them into whole field conservation. And it's also an honor for me to share the discussion with Lee Tesdell, who's one of those practitioners who's really putting it on the ground. So I always like to start when I talk about this as to why. We hear a lot about it's all about downstream water quality and its issues with drinking water sources and receiving waters far downstream. But one of the things I'm interested in is that one of my hobbies is that I like to fish for smallmouth bass, and I live right near the South Skunk River. And so I always like to remind myself and everybody else is that the reason why we're doing this is that many of the edge of field practices particularly don't have much impact on our infield practices, and it's oftentimes the landowners are bearing the cost or the inconvenience, and the benefits are being accrued by folks downstream. So that provides some disincentive. So I like to think more about the why. And the whys can be really local, because anything that we're going to do edge of field, particularly infield and edge of field, but edge of field land management, are really going to have disproportionate benefits locally. It's going to be really providing some improving habitat, improving water quality, and improving the biota for all the invertebrates, fisheries, and then once in a while we might get lucky and catch one of these 17-inch smallmouth bass. This was my stream ecology class a year ago when we were out in the South Skunk River and we were shocking fish and came up with this one. So I always like to remind ourselves why. And the other thing I like to think about is that, when we talk about these edge of field practices, they can be kind of expensive. They can be, technologically, they seem to be the hot thing. But I always like to remind myself that we need to keep it simple. And one of those is just land use change and land use change or land use uh, proper land use adjacent to our streams. And one of those is filter strips and riparian buffers. Perennial vegetation near our streams are really one of the places where I think that we need to start. And it's one of the things that's, as we focus on some of these edge of field practices, it's one that's kind of gone out of vogue. We don't hear much about promoting these edge of field practices like filter strips and riparian buffers. And we've been working, this is where our edge of field work started. We've been working with private landowners in our Bear Creek watershed north of Ames near Roland, Iowa since 1990. I don't even want to think about how many years that has been that we've been working with those private landowners and establishing things that we take for granted now, like filter strips and riparian forest buffers. And our role as a university is to provide research and teaching and education. So our role here is to work with these landowners and do the research. And so we've had a number of graduate students out there and how these things work, and they have really multi-benefits, multiple benefits. Water quality is the one we'll be focusing on today, but pollinator habitat, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas reduction, increase in soil quality, all of the above are accrued by these perennial vegetation practices. And so what we have there, the number on the bottom there is if quoting some of the things from the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy in terms of percent reduction in the practice and reducing nitrate transport from our fields to our streams. And buffers have been shown to reduce 91% of that nitrate that's leaving from, in this case, that soybean field on the left, and that's moving through that shallow subsurface soil to the stream over to the right-hand side, a 91% reduction. And just before I get back into the water quality, and one of those is some of these other benefits. And so we try to enumerate these. And this is just a simple graph that shows, look at the line go up. Well, what's that line go up? That's the number of bird species that we see when we convert something that has that red line where we're row cropping right up to the edge, or intensively grazed or riparian right up to the edge, where we see 12 species over a long-term average. And then as we establish that buffer over in the site age on 0 and then 5 years, 10 years old, 15 years old, you can see that after about 15 years, we start to level out, but we're up over 40 species on average of these in this case birds. And the thing is, the other thing is that we need to remember that what we plant is what we get. So we need to if we want to have pheasant habitat, just about anything you put out there is going to be fine. If you want meadowlarks, like on the lower left, you need to have nice wide zones of lots of grasses. If you're more interested in the woodland edge species like the chickadee or one of the thrashers, then some of that woody component in there would be just fine. But so they provide wildlife habitat. But how about water quality? So just a simple graphic that shows one of the things that we've done since 1996 is that we have a series of wells that go across that. If you think about that picture a couple of slides ago, where we have that crop field on the left and then that buffer going towards the stream. We put a series of wells in lines that go right near the field edge and then across that buffer towards the stream. And we did that multiple lines in 3 different locations. And then we looked at the concentration of nitrate, the difference in concentration of nitrate near the stream or near the field to near the stream. And this graph just shows on the bottom with the arrow is time since we've established that buffer. So 0 on the left was when we first established that buffer. And then you can see 0 to 5 years, 5 to 15 years, and 15 years plus. And then the y-axis is just how well this buffer removes nitrate. And you can see that 0 to 5, we're a little bit slow getting going. We got to get those roots down there. We got to improve that soil carbon, get those bacteria primed and up and going. But by the time you get to 5 and 15 years, you see a rapid increase in that function for water quality. In 15 years, even after 20 years, we're seeing some improvement or increase in nitrate removal efficiency. It's leveled out. So this was that nitrate removal capacity that we said, hey, can we take advantage of this? And one of the challenges we saw is that we're in the Des Moines lobe here in central Iowa, and we have, in order to profitably farm many of our fields, we need to have that subsurface drainage. We need to have that tile drainage. So a lot of our fields are tile drain. And then as we provide that outlet for that upland drainage through these riparian zones, you can see the tile going through our nice multi-species riparian buffer, and that essentially short circuits that nitrate loss that I showed you in the previous slide. It short circuits it because we're gathering all that nitrate laden water from the uplands, and then we're moving it through a pipe right through that stream or right through that buffer, and where we cannot remove any of the nitrate. So my colleague Dan Janes came up with this idea and said, hey, how about if we, and here in this picture, you can see on the left-hand side, you can see that upland field with the tile drainage in it, and then that pipe in the foreground moving from that field, collecting that water and heading towards the stream. And Dad said, hey, why don't we take that tile and we put a box in there, and you can see a box right there in the center, and then run a distribution line through that riparian zone, and then put some gates in that box, and then put a little bit of head on that water, and then move that water out into that distribution line, back out into that soil in that riparian zone, in that streamside zone, and take advantage of that soil that we know is that process that we know is going to be removing nitrate. So that was the hatching of the saturated buffer. First one we put in was in 2010. So I'll give you what I want to talk about here is a little bit of how they work, what we've learned, and application maybe to a little bit different part of the state for me, where you folks all work in Southwest Iowa. First, I'd like to show a video that was recently produced by a group a group of cooperators here in Iowa that shows how a saturated buffer and a bioreactor will work.
Saturated buffers and bioreactors clean tidal drainage water using natural processes underground at the edge of the field, with impacts to crop production and positive impacts downstream. Here's how they work when added to your current drainage system. Excess water drains through field tile lines. It leads to a water control structure at the edge of the field. In a saturated buffer, the control structure directs water to a perforated pipe parallel to the ditch or stream, distributing the water through the soil profile. From there, it seeps into the soil and roots of the filter strip, where microbes turn nitrate into nitrogen gas, which makes up about 80% of our atmosphere. Plants also use nitrate as food. Reactors work similarly, but instead of water flowing into the soil profile and plant roots, a trench of underground wood chips. Bioreactors are used when the landscape doesn't support a saturated buffer. The bypass directly to the tile outlet, preventing unwanted water from backing up into the field. Even with bypass flow, bioreactors and saturated buffers treat 40 to 60% of the overall annual flow of a tile. Edge-of-field practices are some of the nitrate removal tactics currently used. There are two other tools toolboxes. They have even greater impact when paired with cover crops, no-till, and nutrient management.
All right, well, there were a couple of numbers in there that talked about the performance metrics for a saturated buffer or a bioreactor, and one of those was percent of flow treated and then nitrate removal, and those are two important numbers. Well, how do we get those numbers? We have about 20 sites out that we've those estimates. We have about 20 sites out that we have, including on Lee Tesdell's farm, where we're doing some intensive monitoring to how these things work for water quality improvement. And so how we do that, here's one of our sites up in Bear Creek, where we have this field tile coming in from the bottom, the control box, and then the distribution line going upstream and downstream. And then what we'll do, these blue dots that you see here are a series of groundwater monitoring wells that we stretch from the distribution line towards the stream. They're about 10-foot deep, fully screened. So what we're doing is we're capturing that water that gets distributed out of that line as it moves across that riparian zone. And then we could take those back into the lab and look at them for nitrate, nitrogen. So I'm going to show you a data graph here, and what that data graph is showing, that what the graph is going to show you is the concentration of nitrate in the distribution line, is measured in the box, and then the concentration in the well nearest the stream, and a farther well, and a farther well, at a series of wells as it goes across farther from the distribution line, and then in the stream itself. And you see a pattern that the arrow goes down, and that's consistent in all of our monitoring in all of our locations with 100 site years now across the state. When we see that the concentration in that tile line, as that water gets out into that shallow subsurface riparian zone and moves towards the stream, some of it is taken up by the plants, but much of it is lost through that bacterial process that converts it to nitrogen gas, dinitrogen gas, which is lost to the atmosphere, which is a harmless byproduct. So this pattern is consistent, rapid removal as we move across those riparian zones. Well, a couple of quick slides about how do we do this, if a landowner is interested in potentially doing this, or if a project wants to establish buffers within their watershed project. First, we need to identify where those tiles are. Not as easy as it sounds sometimes. We can use GIS techniques to identify the likely location, but we don't have really good records of where all the tiles are. So a lot of boots on the ground to identify where those tiles are. Next thing we need to know is what's the drainage area. And so I'm showing you a site that we put in up in Bear Creek several years ago. In this case, if we can see my arrow here, the tile exits here and moves along here and then drains all of this area in the upland. So then the next thing we need to figure out is, well, how much acre is being drained, which is also a challenge because we do not have records for tile drainage in most of our areas unless it's been recently updated. Then do some surveying to say, is this site going to work? How far upstream, downstream can we go? Are there tiles that we have to worry about crossing? Is there sand and gravel at depth? All that preliminary information. So we decide, let's go ahead and move ahead with this site. First thing we'll do is we'll go to where that outlet's exited that stream, and then we'll take that all the way back. We always are in the habit now of putting new outlets in on all of these locations. So we'll dig that back to where the box is going to go in. And then here you see that control box that's going to be rerouting that water into that distribution line. In this case, it's a big long box. It's a 4-chamber box, and it's a 4-chamber box because this is a site that we're going to monitor. So we need to have additional chambers in it for our monitoring equipment. If this is just one that's going out for just a normal water quality practice, that box is much smaller. It's just a 2-chamber box. In this case, that tile is going to be, that distribution line is going to be routed downstream. So you have the tile plow that's getting ready to hook up that distribution line. These lines can either be plowed in, or in some case, they can be trenched in as well. And so then an aerial view looking from the other direction, you can see that the box is here in the background, and now here's that distribution line that's being plowed in. In this case, we weren't able to go all that far because we had this change in land ownership here in the bottom. And so this was one that went in the field that was cropped. And so then we had to establish the buffer over in the top of that. Many of them that are going in are already going into established filter strips or riparian buffers. And so there's no need to do that seeding on top. The water is then controlled by these, looking down into that box, by these series of gates. So you can, these slide gates that are 6 inches or tall, or they can vary in size from 4 to 8 inches, and you move those up and down, add more, take some out to change that water level within the box. And so here's a sort of a side view of what one of these looks like. And so we have the tile drain that's moving from left to right into the stream. We put that box in there. This is a 3-chamber box. Again, for just normal implementation, this can be a 2-chamber box. And you can see that that small circle here in the middle, that's that distribution line that's coming out towards us in the riparian zone. And then you put these gates in there to put that head on there. And then that water is rerouted into that distribution line as much as that soil will take. Any excess water then just comes back up over that gate and back down into the stream. And we remove no drainage rights from the upstream landowner. I add in here the ideal site for stop log management for minimal management. So what does that mean? In this case, we see that elevated water table, there's little to no impact on that crop field. There's enough grade in here that any increase in that water table isn't going to be impacting any infield management, planting or harvesting. In some cases, and Lee Tesdell has one of those cases where it's rather flat in the riparian zone. And so this water table will potentially be impacting that. And then we can just implement management to open those gates, close those gates as needed to optimize infield management. Then in this case, we need to go in and plant this. So in this case, we planted it with a nice diverse mix of native grasses and forbs. I'm always partial to that for the other benefits of wildlife benefits and carbon sequestration benefits, as opposed to our cool season brome grasses, which also work. And this is what it looks like, this site, another aerial view after establishment in the early establishment phase. Here you can see a series of those monitoring wells across that riparian zone. So that's what it looks like from start to finish to get them in, to get a typical site in. And there's a picture of your next presenter, the good Dr. Lee Tesdell. And I offer this to provide some introduction to Lee, but also to show you this is what a typical 2-chamber box is going to look like. So they're only going to stick out 1 to 2 feet above. And so that's all the landowner needs to worry about, is just avoiding that in any field management. So there's not much really intrusion with this edge of field practice. Showing a little bit of data, and here's some data from Lee Tesdall's farm. In the lower left, you can see it's a larger box, a 3-chamber box, and here's one of our full monitoring setups. And we have the box to be able to have data recorders and a solar panel. In this case, we have some instrumentation down in this box that we can be monitoring water levels and actually changing the gates, open and closing the gates remotely. On the right-hand side is the picture of, again, of aerial view of Lee's farm, the box there, and then the distribution line that goes upstream and downstream, and then the 3 sets of monitoring wells, monitoring that nitrate concentration as it exits the distribution line and moves through the soil. Top graph here shows what we can do with some of these new smart drainage structures. And so this was data that was from last November. It was dry. We had no tile flow, no tile flow. And then we had a rainfall event. And here you can see this black line. That's the tile flow start. So we can see the continuous data of the tile flow starting. And then what it's doing is it's filling that distribution line. We get no bypass flow, no untreated flow. At some point, we've filled up that all the capacity of that of the drainage into the soil. And so you can see in the bottom, here's that untreated flow or that bypass flow. So we're bypassing that flow into the stream, and then total flow, treated flow, and bypass flow. So we're not removing any of the drainage rights upstream. So then just some text of what we've learned. A nice thing is denitrification is the main loss process. So this is a permanent loss of that nitrate to our atmosphere and a harmless byproduct. The perennial vegetation is essential and important. It will take up some of that nitrate on its own, but again, that bacterial process is the main loss process. But that perennial vegetation is the engine. It's providing the carbon. We've seen little difference as to whether that's brome grass out there or frankly reed canary grass versus the perennials, but I'm sure partial to those perennials for the reasons I mentioned earlier. It looks like 30 feet away, if you put that distribution line 30 feet away from the stream, is going to be plenty for nitrate removal, for optimum nitrate removal. We're not going to increase stream bank instability, or as I say it here, saturated buffers do not decrease stream bank stability. We're raising that water level 30 feet away, but by the time we get to that stream, that water level is already down to wherever it is in the stream. So we're not perching a water table in that stream bank. Well, recent data have shown that if we put a second line in there, if we're wide enough and we could have put 2 distribution lines in there, we're going to get significant increase in nitrate removal. Another nice thing is those of us that are concerned about nitrous oxide or greenhouse gas loss to the atmosphere is that even though we're having significant nitrate loss within that riparian zone, we're not trading a water quality problem for an air quality problem, and that is, in net, we are not increasing nitrous oxide or greenhouse gas losses through this. For those that are involved deeply in the conservation practice standard, I offer that the objective should be mass of nitrogen removed, not percent removal. So we shouldn't be worried about percent nitrogen removal. We should be worried about, hey, how many pounds of N are we going to remove? And if anybody has more specific questions about those nuances, I'll be happy to answer that if in a question. So then I was thinking about really quickly some tailoring this. Most of our experiences in the Des Moines Lobe are flat country, some in the Iowa erosion surface. So as we're moving out to the east in the Cedar River drainage, and then some in southeast, but little experience, frankly, in your part of the state with the Golden Hills RC&D. As I think about it, one of the things that we might have to concern ourselves about is that there's a larger numbers of tile inlets, and particularly behind those terraces. And so that's going to be one of our challenges. And here's just some language from the conservation practice standards. It says if the system includes surface inlets, this practice only applies if inlets are adequately protected. And so what we've done in some cases, the landowner or the operator has put perennial vegetation around these inlets. That's been sufficient to meet those practice guidelines. things that we do within the riparian zone or within the design of the distribution line is that we will put a grade on them so that the water at low flow, the water will drain back towards the box and not towards the edge of the distribution line. We'll also put the distribution line a number of inches above the bottom of the box. And so if there's some accumulation of debris or sediment in the bottom of the box, it's not going to go down that distribution line. And you can just open the gates at higher flows and flush that box out on occasion if necessary. A newer one that's just being explored by some of my colleagues over at the University of Iowa. Here you have, on the right-hand side, you have a terrace or a wasp cob with that tile inlet behind it. And so what they're proposing, and they have some examples of this out, that you dig a pit there in the ponded area behind, and that you bury an inlet that has gravel and then wood chips on the bottom to provide that denitrification, and that ponding then goes through those wood chips or goes through that gravel and through those wood chips before it hits that tile line. And notice that there's an overflow and lateral tile here on the left-hand side to provide that full capacity if that ponding gets high enough. So they have a couple of examples of this out in Southeast Iowa, and there's a citation there at the bottom if you're interested. And so then just to finish up real quick, saturated buffers are not your only option. Bioreactors that Lee and I were just talking about, he has one of these on his land where they just actually recharge the wood chips. So you remember the video before. In this case, we're taking that tile water and we're routing it through these wood chips to provide that carbon source for that bacterial process or that nitrate loss process. These are also effective, and these are a great alternative in locations where we cannot put that distribution line in on a saturated buffer, where there are property ownership boundaries or gas lines or other topography that don't allow that. And so these bioreactors are good options, require a little bit more maintenance that Lee can give you his experience about. In your parts of the state over in there, I think that prairie strips are a good idea. So we have a lot of experience with contour buffers. And so there's this ISU has, and others in the state have a project where we put some really nice diverse mixes of perennial native vegetation on a contour buffer in the middle of a field. And you're not only getting the sediment reduction and the water quality improvement reductions, but you're really enhancing wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat, and carbon sequestration. So there's a picture of one that's established for several years on the left and a newer one on the right. And then another one would be potentially a multi-purpose oxbow, where we have cut off stream meanders, and particularly where we have tile drains that might be draining into those. They can provide really, really high rates of nitrate reduction, and wetlands in general can serve that purpose if we route that tile into these multi-purpose oxbows. And these also have the benefit, also again, of many additional wildlife benefits as well. So that will, I'll just end with this picture, and this is a picture of a filter strip that was established. So look at that diverse, already established, look at that diverse vegetation. So going back to my idea, let's keep it simple. Let's start with this perennial vegetation in the landscape in the right location. I think there's ample opportunity to do that. And in this case, after that buffer was established, we went in there and intercepted a tile line that went through that. And you can see the soil on the right-hand side where we established a saturated buffer on the outside of that. And with that, I thank you for your attention on my comments, and we will go to the good Dr. Lee Tesdell.
Well, thanks, Dr. Isenhart. Can everyone hear me okay? Audio's okay? Good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you got that doctor in there, Tom. I appreciate that. I taught in an English department, and I taught technical communication. So I'm somewhat related to this kind of work. Okay, I'm just going to give a few comments about what we've done on the farm here. I'm located in northern Polk County. I'm actually in the 4 Mile Creek watershed. I live on a century farm. It's been in the family since 1884. And we are on Alderman Creek, which is actually one of the tributaries to 4 Mile Creek. And that's has allowed us to do put in some of these edge of field practices and collect data and see how they're working. So there are really 3 areas of conservation work that I try to pursue. One is infield, one is edge of field, and then some perennial cropping. Clearly, perennial cropping is another tool that we can use to improve soil health and water quality on our farms in Iowa. So with the infield, what do I mean? These are practices that you actually find within the row crop acres. I'm fortunate to have a neighbor who has cash rented my row crop acres, who started no-tilling and cover cropping years ago. And so we're also no-till and cover crop for about 12 years. I guess this will be year 13 on the cover cropping, and no-tilling going back quite a few years before that. So talking with landowners and farmers working together can really pay dividends if you can get get on the same page. With no-till, what does that mean? That means we leave the corn stubble alone in the fall after harvest, and same thing with soybean stubble. And we go in, then on the cover cropping, we go in either with a drone or a high clearance machine and cover crop seed into the growing crop, right? And then, so you might ask, well, don't you run over some of your crop when you go in with the high clearance machine? Yes, we do, but we are not organic, and so the 50 acres of my row crop get a couple doses of herbicide during the summer. And so if the high clearance machine is 120 feet, 120-foot boom, just like the sprayer, Nick can just follow the sprayer tracks that are already there. And so he's not running over a lot of extra crop. You do run into a problem if the high clearance is 90 feet instead of 120, or vice versa. And so then you do run over some growing crop. I try to make that fair at the time that we agree on the rent for that year. And so, of course, I don't want my operator to lose money because I ran over some of his crop. On the species for cover cropping, I like to try to mixes. So we like to use cereal rye before soybeans. Soybeans are quite robust. They don't care too much about getting planted green, as we say. In other words, the cereal rye is still growing in late April and May, and we can go right in and plant soybeans right into that, and then kill the cereal rye within a week or two. With corn's a little pickier. Typically, there's something called corn seedling disease that Allison Robertson up at Iowa State is studying. And so we try not to plant cereal rye before corn. We've been trying mixes of oats and camelina and rapeseed and other mixes, but also trying to get some spring growth on that cover crop. As far as edge of field, like Dr. Isenhart mentioned, I do have one wood chip bioreactor, which is 11 years old. We put new wood chips in December 16, 17, just a month or so ago. And then we have 4 saturated buffers. The one that was in the picture with me there is actually on a tile that drains from my neighbor's farm. And that's something I'd like to mention. Edge of field practices offer the opportunity to work with neighbors sometimes. So for example, what does that mean? That means that my neighbor to the west ran a tile across my stream buffer into the creek because that was the shortest route. Of course, he got my permission. I agreed with that. And then a few years later, when we had the opportunity to put in a saturated buffer, he said, yeah, no problem, Lee. If you want to put that on in your buffer, that's fine. And so I'm actually collaborating with a neighbor to clean up his tile water. Um, the let's see, so and then stream buffers we put in 2000. I enrolled those in CRP, so I actually get payments on those acres, about 8 acres of CRP. And like Dr. Isenhart said, it's nice to have that perennial acres to put the distribution line from the saturated buffers into. And as he said, that makes a big difference in the efficiency. We also had built 3 terraces in 1991. We have a certain amount of slope on my farm, and we built those terraces, and then I turned those into prairie strips about 7 years ago. The 4th terrace we built on the west side of the creek, and that's a farmable terrace. If you're familiar with terraces, you can build them farmable on one side or farmable on both sides. This last one we put in was farmable on both sides, and it's working quite well too. The 3 prairie strips I mentioned, those are, I think, 7 years old. We burned them twice. First 3 years, we mowed them, and then you start burning every so often. And we like the benefits we're getting from it. I don't have a lot of data on what they're actually doing for us. We know that the deep roots do help with water infiltration, and aesthetically they're quite pleasing in the summer with the flowers. And we have some Iowa State University honeybee research going on, and they bring hives out, and they're looking at the relationship between the honeybee activity and the prairie strips. And I got a jar of honey out of that every year, so that's nice. And then the third leg on my farm, conservation leg, you might say, is perennial crops. And so I have 5 acres of alfalfa, which we bale for the sheep, and then 7 acres of kernza, which is a perennial grain crop. And kernza is actually a cousin of wheat. It's not gluten-free, but there are a lot of products you can make from the grain. We'll be harvesting our 3rd crop of grain this coming summer. And it's nice to have a perennial crop that we don't have many on the Iowa landscape, but this is one that seems to work pretty well. We just need to develop our markets. Let's see, there's one more thing I'd like to mention about the edge of field practices, and that is that, especially the saturated buffers, that is that it's great to get these practices on the land, but we need to recognize that there are 2 more important steps. And the second step is maintaining them properly. And then the 3rd step is verifying to what extent they're working. I look at all of these tools here that I've listed as tools in the toolbox for landowners and operators to use. None of them offer perfect solutions or silver bullets, but together as a package, I think that we can verify, and I think Dr. Isenhart would agree, we can verify that we are denitrifying much of our tile water, we're improving our soil health, we're increasing wildlife, and keeping our land in good shape for the next generation. But again, none of these by themselves are going to give us a perfect solution to soil health and water quality. So thanks a lot. And I think we have time for questions. This is just an overview a couple of years ago of my farm. You can see the cover crop greening up in May. You see my prairie strips across the on the tile on the terraces, and you see Almond Creek there flowing through my farm. About 1/3 of my farmland is on the west side of the creek and 2/3 on the east side. So with that, thank you all. And thanks to Dr. Isenhart. And I guess we have time for questions and discussion, Sean.
Yeah, I just want to, real quick, I'm gonna put into the chat and then we'll get onto it. I have an evaluation form for this. This is just helpful for us at Golden Hills for future events, and then I'll put that in the chat. But yeah, we can go down to Q&A. I guess and again, if anyone else has any questions that haven't put in the chat, or just do the little reaction, raise your hand, whichever one. We have a couple questions. First one from Red Oak, and I was actually, and maybe Tom could expound more on this because I know he's done a little bit of research. So in case where topography or location doesn't allow for a saturated buffer, kind of like here in Southwest Iowa, along a creek, could a prairie strip be placed on the contour with a distribution line above the strip and a collection line below?
That's an excellent question. And we are actively looking for a site where that might work. So the opportunity that we have there is that we have the perennial vegetation, and there's likely going to be that's been demonstrated that there's high nitrate loss within those soils underneath that prairie strip. So if there's an area where you could take that tile line and intercept it, say within a waterway that's been intercepted by that has a prairie strip that's going perpendicular to it, or not even a waterway if it goes through that prairie strip, and then route that in each direction in the prairie strip, and maybe put a collection line on the bottom of it so that we can avoid any side hill seep. I think it would work. We think it would work. We're looking for places where we could try that. We keep finding a challenge when we're out there is that when we try to run when we are identifying a site where we could run a distribution line along the prairie strip, oftentimes what we're finding is that that prairie strip is already being intercepted by infield tile lines. So our distribution line would have the challenge of intercepting all those or going across all those tile lines that are going already across that prairie strip. I probably didn't explain myself very well, but in the right setup, I think that would work.
Thanks. And I know on that, you're also looking at research on that, and I'll probably send this out in an email, but there was a webinar about a month ago that I think Iowa Learning Farms did on doing that with grass waterways too. So I'll probably
we've done that on grass waterways. I'm working with the group where we've done one up near in Grundy County and then one up in Blackhawk County. Again, a waterway is also going to be a hot spot, if you will, for nitrate loss in the landscape. And the issue is just going to be the plumbing. Can we get the water into that soil? And so we have two models that are out there, one up in Blackhawk and one up in Grundy, which was the focus of that Iowa Learning Farms virtual field day. So yes, waterways as well. Anywhere where we have perennial vegetation and enough carbon in the soil are going to be hot spots for nitrate loss. And if we can just replumb the system to get the water there, we're going to get nitrate removal.
That's good. Thanks. And like I said, I'll share the link to that webinar when I send out an email after this, if anyone else is interested. That's specifically on grass waterways and putting it on different parts of the landscape. And then the other question again that we have at the moment is from Maggie. You mentioned that mass reduction of N as the key factor, yet you list 91% reduction by saturated buffer and 43% reduction by bioreactors. Please expound on the mass N reduction.
That was that question that I offered if there was any follow-up that I would address, so I better address it. And I put a slide in here. Let's see if I can get back up and share. Okay, so I assume I'm sharing again. We can see it. Okay. So yeah, here's my data graph because I was ready for it. So a couple of sites here. IA1, Bear Creek 2. And look at, first of all, the drainage areas. So one of them is 4.7 hectares. So one of them is the top one, 4.7 hectares is about 12 acres. Next one is about 100 acres. Saturated buffer length. Okay, so how much we were limited by topography and land ownership. 308 meters or about 1,000 feet. 168 meters or about 550. So notice we have smaller drainage area, larger drainage area, less or longer pipe length, shorter pipe length. If you run that through the NRCS engineering spreadsheet, design capacity would say this is going to be treating 5% of the pipe full flow, meeting standard. This is 0.6 of the design or of the pipe full flow, not meeting standard, although it says or as much as possible. So, but if you look at that, then fraction of total end load removed, and we look at this top one and we go 81%. And the bottom one, we say 19%. Well, if you just stopped at those two columns, you would say, look, this is removing 81%. This is removing 19%. This is going to be your better buy. But if you look at that, it all has to do with this relationship of how many acres are we draining? What's our pipe length? And it's really this, how many acres are we draining over here on the left? This one is only draining those 12 acres. This one's draining 100 acres. So let's come all the way over to the right-hand column. And on this one, because of that smaller drainage area, we're only seeing flow into that saturated buffer 135 days a year. This one, we're receiving 270 days a year. So if you think about how much water we're getting into that saturated buffer over the year, the larger drainage area, even with the shorter pipe length, is going to be treating more water. So when we look at that in actual performance in kilograms or pounds N removed, 66, 183, or to put in pounds, sorry, 145 here, 403 here. So this one is treating 2.7 times the amount of nitrogen in terms of mass, which is what we want to do, even though this, if you just looked at percent N removed, it can be really, really misleading. So, those of you who heard me speak before, I'm pretty outspoken that we need to be careful about this fraction of total of pipe full flow, and that we need to be focusing on this, because what happens is that when we look at just percent, the total percent of that number that was in that video of 45%, that is of total nitrogen. This is getting complicated. Total nitrogen lost from the field. That includes how much we bypassed. Remember, anything that we get out the distribution line and into that soil, we get about 100% nitrate removal. So the whole key is how much water can we get into that soil? And that's going to be, give me a longer distribution line, give me a larger drainage area. And I frankly, this is something that this percent of design capacity is something that can be a little bit misleading when we want to be focusing mainly on this nitrate removal capacity.
Right. Tom, if I could follow up, examples from my farm, two quick things. One thing is we're getting different kinds of rainfall events, right? So I've had 3, 4, 5-inch rainfall events within a day or two. But then like last fall, we had kind of an extended period of a little bit here and a little bit there. And then if you add in the cover crop, with the roots, the living roots in the soil most of the time. It seems to me that we're probably going to be changing the water flow in our tiles in those two ways. So heavy events, and then cover crop roots holding the water so it doesn't flow as quickly through the drain tiles. What do you see there as far as influence on the saturated buffers?
In terms of tile, in terms of tile intensity?
In terms of flows and therefore how much water is either treated or not treated.
Yeah, we actually, higher flows we can treat less because we
Right.
fill up that pipe and and the rest gets bypassed.
Right.
Anecdotally, Lee, what we saw happen is that one of our first site that we went in, it was initially random tiling. It was old tiling, and so it was just random that would go out to the potholes, and then they went in and so if you think about it, that drains slower. Okay.
Right.
And so then the amount of water that we don't exceed the capacity of our distribution line nearly as much. They went
Right.
in there to improve their crop production and put in pattern tiling. And it
Right.
certainly improved their drainage in their field, but
Right.
it changed that hydrograph on us. Now that
I
water
bet.
comes quicker and
Yep.
we can't capture as much because it gets bypassed because it comes quicker. So
Right.
that's a really good question.
Thanks.
Going back to the percent, Maggie, I don't know if I answered your question. If I didn't, please follow up with another one or feel free to reach out to me.
You got the thumbs up from Maggie.
Actually, I'll comment because I find percentages can be so misleading. They have to be based on a base, as you showed. So I hate using percentages without accompanying it with an actual number.
Agreed. I see a question from Red Oak Field Office on the comment about bank stability. Has this been tested in our loess soils? I'll be quite frank and say no, it has not. All of our empirical data collection and modeling has been on more of our loamy soils over here. I'd be interested to think about that. Yes, as you're well aware, the loess soils are much more erodible. But I also think that because of their percolation rates are going to be higher, we're probably not going to be perching that water. I think that water's, by the time, again, that distribution line puts that water into the soil, by the time it gets to the stream, it's already going to be down to the stream level. We're going to be losing a lot more of it with deeper infiltration and percolation. That's a guess on my part. We've not done the work over there.
Tom, what do you see? Have any idea what farm pond influence on nitrate levels is? As we know, Southwest Iowa, there's a lot more cattle, slopier land, more terraces, and farm ponds. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, Keith Schilling and gang over at University of Iowa Geologic Survey published a paper on that, and all of that sediment that's in a farm pond and all of that vegetation that's in there is all going to be a real hot spot for nitrate removal. So if we have tile drainage or any nitrate in the surface water that's feeding into a pond, the concentration coming out is almost always going to be lower, and it's going to be a function of the surface area to water volume. So the greater the surface area compared to the water in the pond, the higher nitrate removal percent you will get. Again, mass is probably going to be the same, but percent is going to be better. Yeah, they'll function as hotspots in the landscape as well.
Okay, thanks.
And I see George asked a question, can you use bigger tile in a saturated buffer to get more capacity to filter? That's an excellent question. What we're seeing is that no, because we're not limited. The amount of water that you can get into the saturated buffer is not limited by the size of the distribution line. To use the technical term, it's limited by the saturated hydraulic conductivity of the soil, and that is how much water can you be pushing through the soil. And so that's going to be limiting it, not the size. In fact, we have one experimental site where we've in that distribution line, we made it like a French drain for a septic system and put gravel around it, thinking that we might be able to increase the amount of water that we're getting out. It doesn't look like we are on our early data, again, because we're limited by how tight those soils are.
All right.
Good question.
Yeah. Maggie has a question for me about terraces. Yeah, what I meant by farmable on one side, farmable on two sides, I guess I don't know the technical terms, but the more recent one that we built, basically it allows the planter to flow along pretty well. The only thing we have to drive around is the one intake for the tile under that terrace. As you know, terraces require tiles because you don't want the tile to be breached in very heavy rainfall. The three older terraces that we built are simply too steep on one side to farm. I originally, when we built them, when 12-row equipment was more common. Now we're at 24-row corn planter on my farm. So the farmable on one side hardly works anyway. And then I went ahead and just seeded them down for prairie strips. So they're not actually farmable at all now, unless you call prairie strips farming, which I do. But yeah, Maggie, it may be just a terminology difference, but yeah, that's what mine look like.
We'll give a moment if anyone has any other questions. Otherwise,
What are you seeing in your area, Sean? What are the more popular conservation measures that you're seeing out there?
trying to think out the top of my head.
I would assume cover crops
Yeah,
and terraces, maybe, or
yeah, cover crops and terraces.
yeah, okay.
And NRCS folks could probably chime in better than me or Lance, but
Right.
Uh, since people are being quiet, I'll just turn on my mic. I looked into doing a saturated buffer on my farm, and I work with the Red Oak Field Office. So I was told that it wouldn't work on my farm, and it's mainly because the slope of the land along, because I have a riparian buffer along my creek. And I just thought of adding the saturated buffer to divert the tile, because the tiles are going directly into the creek. I have 3 going in. But they said because the slope from west, higher on the west to lower on the east, it wouldn't work. But the illustrations you showed put the box at almost one end and just had the water flowing one direction. So I'm wondering why I was told it wouldn't be suitable, but I think it was mainly more of a cost versus return. I don't know if who's in the Red Oak office, if they'd be willing to speak, because mine would have been the first saturated buffer in our area, and I really wanted that. But I know it would have been, they thought it would be a large expense for the benefit.
Okay. Maggie, this is Dan. Yes, it was a cost efficiency thing. So this brings up another good question. what are you seeing for cost effectiveness on the stream slope of the stream channel? So in Maggie's case, it was over 2%. So we would have to essentially put a control box every 200 feet. If that makes sense.
I think I understand. So what you're saying is, so the slope upstream downstream is 2%, and so you'd have to put a box in and drop it lower to keep it deep enough. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've done that. And there is additional cost. You know, you need to put one more agri-drain box in whatever length, whatever distance that is, just to drop it down. Yeah, we have done that. And we've seen they work. They do work if your soils work. But there is that added expense of putting those boxes in.
Yeah. So it would work, Maggie. It's just how much do we want to spend on control boxes?
Yeah, but actually though, the stream levels out further east from where, yeah, the tile lines happen to be at the steepest area. And I don't know if we had taken it out further east, but now I didn't have a ton of water coming through those tiles anyway. And now I'm going to 100% perennial, so it's not an issue.
There you go. You've solved the issue.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
Good for you, Maggie.
that is going to be an issue everywhere. We try to put a saturated buffer is with our stream gradients. You know, what is cost effective? What is the cutoff? You know,
Right.
how often can we afford to put a control box?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Like I
Good.
say, and also the places that would work the best are along the river bottom, which are flat fields and they aren't tiled as much around here. The ones that are terraced and tiled are on steeper slopes away from
Correct.
the rivers, and those creeks are flowing toward the river at a steeper angle.
Yep. On the East Nishnabotna and the Nottoway, we have a lot of pattern tile along the rivers, and it would be a good opportunity, but the rivers are also 20 to 30 feet deep. So that brought back my bank stability question.
I think that your question about cost effectiveness is an important one. And I think that the number ought to be looked at is, you know, how many pounds of N are potentially treated. So if that's something that requires, if it's a site that requires 2 or 3 control boxes to keep it at grade, and we're only draining 25 acres, then that's a question of, you know, how much pounds, you know, dollars per pounds of N treated versus if that's something that's draining 150 acres, then that calculus changes a little bit. But it's it's the way we need to be looking at it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here again too. Is there funding to get a research project in this area that Dan could work on some pattern tiling with a steep bank into the river to test the bank erosion situation, or to get some data in our area?
Yeah, and we have water quality initiative money that, you know, we could address these sites, and we just need to think it through when we find a site that we want to address. So yeah, all the help, more help, the merrier.
Yeah, and find a landowner willing to experiment.
Right.
Fine.
Exactly.
I think we'll have plenty of those. But.
Find your Lee Tesdell.
Well, Maggie's 5 steps ahead of me, so you got your your experimental farm there.
Oh no, but I don't have Kernza yet, and I want Kernza.
Right. You all bring up a really important point talking about mass of N removed, and I'm foreseeing the day when that's worth dollars and cents. So think about that. if, as long as we can verify the removal amounts from each saturated buffer, I think that's going to be worth money. So let's keep that thought as well.
We have one more question from someone who's from Nebraska, because I think one of the two people that registered. What do you see happening across the river in Nebraska? Similar practices?
If that, I'm not sure how much I can add to that. In terms, I know of no saturated buffers that have been established in Nebraska. I hope I'm just ill-informed on that. But I know of none. And I don't know of much bioreactor research or monitoring that's going on in Nebraska either. And I think it's probably just a difference in the farming and the tiling, because our neighbors across the north into Minnesota, and our neighbors to the east in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, where we have a lot of tile drainage, are certainly have active programs in these areas.
Well, unless anyone has one more burning question. That should be a wrap. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming today and attending. Thank you so much, Lee and Thomas, and even Dan a little bit from his experience. So like I said, I'll send out an email with that link and maybe a couple other things. So be on the look for that, anyone that's attended. And everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Good to see everybody.